Welcome. This is week 3 of History 363, Eastern Europe, Life and Death on the Eastern Front. My name's Robert Green. Last week, we talked about the major narrative of the war on the Eastern Front. We examined the German strategy, talked about a few key turning points, the Battle of Moscow, the Battle of Stalingrad, turning points that shifted the initiative on the Eastern Front from the German to the Soviet side. We thought about in our readings the experience of ordinary German soldiers, the indoctrination of soldiers fighting on the Eastern Front, and finally considered some of the factors behind the Soviet victory over the Nazis in 1945. I want to back up a little bit this week and think about life for ordinary men and women living on occupied territory in the Eastern Front. I want to focus on Poland this week. Last week, I mentioned that by the winter of 1941, 6 months into Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's armies controlled more than 700,000 square miles of Soviet and Polish territory, land inhabited by 75 million people. This entire territory right here, 700,000 square miles, 75 million people. And today and over the next few weeks, I want to focus on, as I said, the experience of ordinary people, ordinary men and women living on occupied territory. Think about the sort of dynamics of life and death, the techniques of survival that ordinary people, Poles, Jews, Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, improvised over the period 1939 to 1945. And as we think about this, I want to consider also how the nature of the fighting on the Eastern Front, which, as we've seen, as Hitler had predicted, would be a war of annihilation, how the nature of the fighting brought the war home to touch the lives of civilian populations in almost unimaginable ways. This week, we'll talk about Poland. Next week, turn to the Soviet Union. And as we do, we'll consider what the realities of German occupation meant for ordinary non-German people on this territory, how Nazi racial thinking was implemented into policy for those millions who found themselves living on occupied territory. The Poles had the distinction of being victimized by both the Nazis and the Soviets at various times, and at times simultaneously, over the period 1939 to 1945. The Poles were utterly unprepared to face the Germans when war broke out in 1939. This map shows you the beginnings of the campaign in Poland. And of course, the Second World War, as you'll recall, began in Poland on September 1st, 1939, with the German invasion. The Poles had been pouring a great deal of money into defense over the past half-decade. Since 1933, nearly half of the annual Polish state budget was allocated for national defense, but in absolute terms, Poland was simply too poor a country and its industrial base too underdeveloped to stand up for long against Germany. Statistics bear this out. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was able to put 2,000 aircraft into the skies above Poland. The entire Polish Air Force came to only 420 planes. The Germans had 2,600 tanks to Poland's 880. And in 1939, the Poles still did not have adequate telegraph networks in place, which meant that coordination and communication between units and headquarters was almost impossible. When Germany invaded Poland with 1.5 million men on September 1st, 1939, the Polish army fought valiantly, but they could only hold out for so long. You may have heard the story of Polish cavalry charging in futility against German tanks. This was the stuff of Nazi propaganda, stories invented by the Germans to discredit and humiliate the Poles in the eyes of the international media. In truth, the Poles did have cavalry units, as you can see from this photograph, but the Polish cavalry were sort of rapid recon and scouting units, often deployed against infantry. Even if the Poles had been able to hold out against the Germans, and they couldn't for very long, Poland's fate was sealed on September 17th, 1939, when, in accordance with the secret protocols of the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, which we talked about last week, the USSR invaded Poland from the east. As you can see from this map, on September 1st, 1939, the Germans invaded Poland from the west. On September 17th, the Soviet Army, the Red Army, comes in from the east. Stalin explained to the world that he was entering Poland simply in order to defend Ukrainians and Belarusians against the German attack, since the collapsing Polish state was obviously unable to protect its own citizens. Of course, this was utter nonsense. Here you see a Soviet poster from September of 1939, written in Ukrainian, and addressing Ukrainian audiences, explaining to them that Soviet power has entered Poland to liberate the impoverished Ukrainian people from the oppression of the landowning classes. And what we see here in this image is the sort of stylized Red Army soldier making short work of this snarling Polish landowning army officer and liberating these oppressed Ukrainian peasants. So the Soviet propaganda portrayed this as a war of liberation, and the Soviet army as an emancipating force, right, here to free the Ukrainian and Belarusian people. Most of eastern Poland was absorbed into the Soviet Union, and the land was sort of split between the Belarusian Soviet Republic and the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. Soviet propaganda made this forcible annexation seem as if it was a joyous reunion of fraternal Slavic peoples. And here you see another poster, also written in Ukrainian, calling upon ethnic Ukrainians in eastern Poland to cast their votes, to vote yes in favor of joining the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, to become part of the Soviet Union, as if they had a choice in this election. The election was rigged. When the votes were counted and or manufactured, the results, were clear. Eastern Poland had overwhelmingly voted, surprise, surprise, to join the glorious Soviet Republic. And we see here this poster showing a Ukrainian peasant on the left, a Soviet Red Army soldier on the right, and together they're toppling the border. They're toppling the border post that had hitherto divided these peoples and their countries. And we see sort of darkness on the left, a radiant light of socialism on the right. Darkness on the left, the sun of socialism on the right. And you see the factory in the background, the tractor in the fields. These are the glorious advantages of technology and modernity that the Soviet Union is bringing to the peoples of Eastern Poland as they join the Soviet Union. On September 28th, 1939, Warsaw fell to the German army. Here you see German soldiers marching through the Polish capital. The Polish government fled, setting up a government in exile in London, without ever surrendering to the Germans, a fact that they were very proud of during the war years. By early October of 1939, the last scattered fighting had drawn to a close, and the Nazis and Soviets split up Poland between them. Here you see the demarcation line between the Nazi zone of control and the Soviet zone of control by the end of September 1939. So less than 20 years after an independent Poland had been recreated by the Treaty of Versailles, ending World War I, less than 20 years later, Poland had once again disappeared from the map of Europe. Poland had lost to the Germans and Soviets more than 66,000 dead, 134,000 wounded, nearly 700,000 captured. Military casualties of 904,000 in just 1 month. For most Poles, however, the worst was still to come. And I want to think a little bit about the occupation of eastern Poland by the Soviets, because this will tie in to our reading of Jan Gross's book, Neighbors, towards the end of the semester. To really understand that book, I think we have to understand first the dynamics of Soviet occupation in the East. And then from there, I want to turn to a discussion of Nazi occupation in the West. In what had formerly been Eastern Poland, now absorbed into the Soviet Union, Soviet power waged a class war against the former elites of Polish society. Between 1939 and 1941, tens of thousands of Polish officers were arrested by the Soviet authorities on charges of having conspired with counter-revolutionary elements, that is to say, having served in the Polish army. The head of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, Lavrenti Beria, explained to Stalin that these Polish officers arrested should be shot, along with other recalcitrant elements of the Polish population, non-socialist intellectuals, landowners, doctors, professionals, priests, politicians, lawyers, etc. Beria's logic was that these social elements would be an impediment to the consolidation of Soviet power in Eastern Poland, and these would be the natural figures and leaders around whom an anti-Soviet Polish resistance would naturally coalesce. So it would be best to eliminate them now, Beria proposed. Stalin was convinced, and here you see orders signed by Stalin, March 1940, giving the assent to the execution of Polish military prisoners, officers in Soviet custody. You see Stalin's signature and the signatures of Vorshilov, Molotov, Mikoyan, Stalin's underlings, his henchmen. Over the course of 1940 and the first half of 1941, thanks to orders like this, the Soviet forces executed between 20 and 30,000 Polish officers and soldiers, political leaders, professionals, intellectuals, and priests. Executed them and buried them in mass graves in and around the Katyn forests of eastern Poland. In 1943, the Germans came across these mass graves in the Polish woods. They uncovered the massacre sites of the Polish dead, and they publicly indicted the Soviets for what they'd done. In fact, the Germans brought Allied POWs and doctors to the site to confirm, A, that there had been a massacre, and B, that it was the work of the Soviets. Stalin denied the allegations, and neither Franklin Roosevelt nor Winston Churchill pressed their ally on the matter. Not until 1990, under Mikhail Gorbachev, did the Soviet Union publicly acknowledge responsibility for the Katyn massacres. Horrific as the Katyn massacres were, the Soviets did not stop there. Between 1939 and 1941, the Soviets arrested about 500,000 former Polish citizens now on Soviet territory. That's about 10% of the adult population. Hundreds of thousands of them were deported into the Siberian labor camps, the gulags. Many more were simply executed. Collectivization of agriculture was forced upon the Polish and Ukrainian farmers. Political parties were outlawed. Censorship was imposed. So all of the repressive transformations that had taken place over the past 2 decades inside the Soviet Union were imposed on Soviet-occupied Eastern Poland in just 2 short years. And given that restricted period of time, the transformations were enormously traumatic. The Soviets, as I said, waged a class war across the eastern half of Poland. A class war so brutal that many Poles were glad to see them go when the Soviets retreated after the Germans invaded Operation Barbarossa the summer of 41. Many Poles thought that as bad as the Soviets were, the Germans couldn't be any worse. That's, again, sort of the context for Jan Gross's book Neighbors. If the Soviets waged a class war in eastern Poland, the Nazis waged a race war in western and central Poland, a race war aimed at cleansing this land of undesirables and laying the groundwork, preparing for the expansion of the superior German race. A full week before the invasion, Hitler had given hints to his inner circle as to what form the Nazi occupation of Poland would take. Here again, you see Poland divided between both sides. Hitler said the object of the war is physically to destroy the enemy. That is why I have given orders to kill without pity or mercy all men, women, and children of Polish descent or language. Only in this way can we obtain the living space we need. When Poland fell to the German army, the bulk of Polish territory in the west was directly annexed to the German Reich. You see here, all of this territory in the west was directly annexed. Territories of Silesia, West Prussia, Poznan. These were lands that had been part of the German Empire, but land that had been taken from Germany after World War I at the Treaty of Versailles to help build the new independent Polish state. So these lands were directly annexed into the German Reich. 1.5 million ethnic Poles living in these lands in the West were forced by the Nazis to leave their homes with virtually no advance warning, to leave their homes and head to the east for resettlement. And here you see a group of Polish citizens being forced from their homes, from their land, by the Germans. Forced from their homes to make room for new German settlers. More than 750,000 German settlers were brought in to repopulate this newly acquired German Lebensraum, or living space. So it was the first case of the kind of ethnic cleansing that would become so much a part of European life for the next decade. All Polish landholdings were seized by the Nazis. Polish bank accounts were confiscated. Money could be withdrawn only by clients who presented a certificate attesting to their ethnic origin. In other words, only ethnic Germans. Whatever Poles had in the bank was forfeit. Special permits were required for shopkeepers and businessmen, and of course those permits were only issued to ethnic Germans. If we come back to this map, as you see, as I said, in the west, the Germans directly annexed this territory. In the east, the Soviets directly annexed this territory. And in the center of Poland stood the so-called general government. And the general government was, simply put, a dumping ground. It was a place for the Germans to send all the Poles and Jews who had been expelled from their homes in the western towns and cities. The general government was about 70,000 square miles, and it housed some 22 million people. The capital, the former capital of Warsaw, was in the general government. Many of the concentration camps that we'll speak of in a few weeks were located in the general government or close by. Also, most of the Jewish ghettos existed in the general government, as you can see from this map. We'll talk more about ghettos when we speak about the Holocaust in a few weeks, but our readings this week bring up the question of the ghetto. So I want to begin to talk about it a little bit, and we'll talk about it more in our discussion. The ghettos were administrative enclaves set up by the Nazi occupying force to isolate Jews from the general population. And between 1939 and 1942, the Nazis set up nearly 250 all across occupied Poland. The vast majority of them, as you can see, were in the general government. Our reading this week is a diary kept by a young Jewish man named David Sirakowiak, who was a resident in the ghetto at Łódź. And here you see Łódź, L-O-D-Z, the Polish L pronounced like a W, Łódź, which is just outside of the general government. We'll talk again more about life inside the ghettos as we move forward in the semester. So the general government, as you see here, this general space to which ethnic Poles and Jews from the West were dumped and confined, the general government was placed under the direct administration of the Ostministerium, that is the Reich Ministry for Occupied Eastern Territories, and it was governed by Obergruppenführer Hans Frank, shown here. Frank was a lawyer by training and a fanatical Nazi, later hanged at Nuremberg. The name is telling, I think, if we think about, again, the general government. What does the name mean? Calling this territory the general government, giving it this sort of bland, generic appellation, stripped it and its people of all Polish identity. And the Nazi administrators immediately outlawed on the territory of the general government all Polish political parties, government institutions, even social clubs or private organizations. For Frank and the Ostministerium, the general government existed for one purpose. Its natural and human resources were to be extracted and exploited ruthlessly in support of the Nazi war effort. Martin Bormann, shown here on the far right, Hitler's closest aide, the secretary of the Nazi Party, Bormann described the general government as a Polish reservation, a great Polish labor camp. And the policy of ruthless extraction, transforming the general government into a workhouse for the Nazi war effort, was implemented almost immediately. Already in October of 1939, Hermann Goering, shown here, Goering in charge of the Reich's economic planning offices, had this to say: "We must remove from the territory of the general government all raw materials, scrap materials, machinery, etc., that are of use to the German war economy. All industry and enterprises that are not absolutely necessary for the bare maintenance of the population must be transferred to Germany." And with this in mind, raw materials, industry, enterprises were taken out of the general government and brought onto German territory, extracted from the general government and put onto German territory to be used for the German war effort. This included human beings as well. Some 3 million able-bodied Poles were rounded up, sent to Germany for forced labor. Men and women were sent to separate factories, separate plants. Families were split up and divided, in many cases never to see each other again. Polish laborers on German territory wore a purple P, like you see here, on their lapels to distinguish them. They were subjected to longer hours and lower wages than other workers. And here on the bottom right, you see the identity card that Polish workers were obliged to carry, and stamped with a red P to indicate that the bearer of this was an ethnic Pole, an Untermensch. About 10% of the population of the general government was sent west to Germany to work in the factories to support the war effort. More than 200,000 children of mixed Polish and German heritage were deported from the general government back to Germany and placed in state-run facilities to undergo what the Nazis called Germanization. Those who responded well to the process were placed with German families for adoption. Those who did not adjust well to this process of reculturation, of cultural brainwashing, those who did not respond well were sent to labor camps or even used for medical experimentation. 75% of these children of mixed Polish and German heritage, 75% of them never returned home to their families. For those who remained behind in the general government, life was exceptionally hard. In accordance with Nazi racial ideology, the population of occupied Poland was legally reclassified into different categories depending on racial identity. Ethnic Germans, ethnic Poles, and Jews living on occupied territory lived by different laws, and each group's rights, or lack thereof, were dependent on their racial status. Here you see a sign on a tram car in the Polish city of Krakow that reads, "For Germans only." Poles and Jews were barred from many forms of public transportation. Poles and Jews, whose daily lives had been difficult enough before the war, found themselves essentially impoverished overnight. Land, property, assets, bank accounts, as I said, all confiscated by the Nazis. Instead of minimum wage laws, the Germans imposed maximum wage laws inside the general government to ensure that no Polish worker earned very much money. According to one economic historian, the standard of living for Poles in 1940 under German occupation had plummeted to only 40% of its already low pre-war level. In the general government, food and supplies were rationed. Meat, sugar, etc. Ethnic Poles, on average, in the general government, consumed only about a third of the caloric intake they had before the war. A full 1/4 of the Polish population had to rely on soup kitchens in order to eat, and the only reason the Germans fed them was to keep them alive in case their labor was required by the state for the war effort. Frank's administration argued that rations for the Poles should be kept at bare subsistence levels, arguing that in the long term this would help cut down the Polish population, since undernourishment would lead to higher levels of infant mortality and thus assist the Germans in their ultimate long-term goal of culling the Polish population, of cleansing this land and making it fit for German resettlement. By 1941, Poles in Warsaw were reduced to rations of 669 calories a day. The Jews of Warsaw, 184 calories per day. As you might expect, malnutrition and anemia were endemic. In Warsaw alone, anemia rates went up 113% among the Polish population, a staggering 435% among Jews crowded into the Warsaw ghetto. And again, when you read David Sierokowiak's account of life in the Łódź ghetto, one of the things to pay attention to is the question of food, how you survive in this terrible condition. Some have argued, convincingly I think, that the general government was administered like a colonial territory. Hans Frank admitted as much in December of 1940. He said, "In this country, the general government, the force of determined leadership must rule. The Pole must not feel that we are building him a legal state. Rather, the Pole must feel that for him there is only one duty, namely to work and to behave himself." Work meant deportation to Germany. How Poles were to behave was a much more subjective question. Frank's administration issued a series of draconian decrees that declared the death penalty for engaging in economic speculation, trafficking in food on the black market, the death penalty for aiding Jews in any way, even giving them food or clothing, the death penalty for failing to join the compulsory labor brigades when summoned, and, most notoriously of all, worded with a kind of deliberate ambiguity, the death penalty for any acts committed against the German government. What you see here is an order from 1939 printed in German on the left, in Polish on the right, threatening that all Polish farmers who did not submit the required quantity of grain to their new German overlords would be shot. The Germans practiced a kind of collective punishment as an intimidation factor. If any violent act of resistance took place, the Nazis would simply round up the first dozen or so Poles off the streets and execute them in public or deport them straight off to Germany for labor. And here you see a photograph of such a roundup. In Polish, these were called, such a roundup was called a łapanka. And this particular roundup photographed here was in the streets of Warsaw. Here, a group of Polish prisoners hanged in public by the Germans outside the train station in Krakow. Actions such as these were intended by the Germans to terrorize and thus subdue the Polish population. The long-term goal, though, as I said, the long-term goal of the Nazis was to literally change the ethnic composition of the Polish lands. In May of 1941, Hitler declared that within 15 to 20 years, Poland must be a purely German area. And again, this was in keeping with the notion of Lebensraum, living space, that Hitler had been advocating since the 1920s. Living space for the superior German race, acquired, of course, at the expense of the inferior peoples of Eastern Europe, Jews and Slavs. Hitler declared, where 12 million Poles live now is to be populated by 4 to 5 million Germans. The territory of the general government must become as German as the Rhineland. So to make this territory as German as the Rhineland meant to simultaneously exploit and extract all resources from the region while also stripping Poland of its Polish identity. And to that end, the Nazi occupation force waged a relentless campaign against Polish culture and language, because these, of course, are the chief vehicles of ethnic identity, of national identity. The Germans referred to this as depolonization, or more euphemistically, as special pacification, a special pacification of the Polish people, aimed, of course, at liquidating vestiges of Polish culture. Monuments were destroyed, historical buildings were razed, scientific and artistic collections were pillaged. Here you see a Raphael portrait of a young man. This was stolen from a museum in Krakow. Other works of art that the Germans deemed insufficiently historical or of cultural importance were simply destroyed. Education was sharply curtailed. Hans Frank declared that the Poles do not need universities or secondary schools. The Polish lands are to be transformed into an intellectual desert. And in keeping with this, colleges, laboratories, universities, museums, archives, institutions of higher learning were all shut down. In a 1940 memo, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, shown here on the left with Hans Frank on the right, Himmler explained that the sole goal of teaching Poles is to teach them simple arithmetic, nothing above the number 500, how to write one's name, and the doctrine that it is the law to obey a German. I do not think that it is desirable to teach them how to read. From the very start, the Nazis staged multiple mass executions of any Polish men or women who might possibly form opposition to Nazi rule. Military officers, political figures, professors, students, in other words, the elites of Polish society, members of the educated classes, members of the propertied classes. And the Nazis referred to this targeting and eliminating the elites of Poland as a means of depolonization. They referred to this as Intelligenzaktion. And even before the invasion, the Gestapo, the German police, drew up lists of names of prominent Poles to be arrested and or executed when the German invasion and occupation was in place. So before the invasion, between 1937 and 1939, a list of 61,000 Poles was drawn up. Scholars, politicians, actors, noblemen, doctors, professors, scientists, even at least one member of the Polish Olympic team that had competed at Berlin in 1936. Their names were assembled in this so-called Special Prosecution Book, In October of 1940, Hitler explained the rationale behind this to Bormann and Himmler. He said Poles may have only one master, the German. Two masters cannot exist side by side. This is why all members of the Polish intelligentsia, the educated class, must be killed. It sounds cruel, but such is the law of life. SS Chief Heinrich Himmler took a more utilitarian approach. He said all Polish specialists will be exploited in our military-industrial complex. Later, all Poles will disappear from this world. It is imperative that the great German nation considers the elimination of all Polish people as its chief task. The Nazis, in their racial vision, agreed that Poland would be depolonized, that the land would be put under German settlement and cultivation, that the people themselves would be slowly starved out, their leaders executed and shot. And this is the thinking behind the depolonization campaigns. Reinhold Heydrich, Himmler's deputy, the number 2 man in the SS, explained, "The little people we'll spare for now, but the nobles, priests, and Jews must be killed." And here you see a photograph of Polish Catholic priests with civilians being prepared for execution in the market square in the town of Bydgoszcz in the fall of 1939. 25% of Polish Catholic clergy perished under Nazi occupation, half of them in the concentration camps. 25% of Polish scientists, 25% of all Polish school teachers. Here you see a group of teachers, again from the town of Bydgoszcz, being led to the so-called Valley of Death outside of town. More than 6,000 Poles and Jews were shot here in Bydgoszcz alone in the fall of 1939, buried in mass graves outside the city. In the first 2 months after the Nazi invasion alone, there were 764 public mass executions like this across Poland, part of what the Nazis called Operation Tannenberg. And these mass executions resulted in a total of 20,000 Polish men and women murdered by the Nazis in the fall of 1939 alone. All in all, when you add up battle casualties with executions and exterminations, approximately 6 million Polish citizens died during World War II. About 3 million ethnic Poles, about 3 million or so Polish Jews. And 90% of those 6 million Poles who perished were civilians. Now, if we take this figure, 6 million dead Polish citizens, that comes to about 17 to 18% of the pre-war Polish population. That's almost 1 out of every 5 Polish citizens. Proportionally, this is the highest death rate of any country in Europe during the Second World War. And to get a handle on that figure, to try and wrap your head around this, think of it this way. 18% of the U.S. population today is about 57 million. That's almost the entire population west of the Rocky Mountains. So imagine if the entire populations of California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Montana were wiped out. Just imagine the effect this would have. Imagine the psychological effect. This is, proportionally speaking, the kind of loss that Poland sustained during the Second World War, losing 17 to 18% of its entire population. And this is the kind of devastation that Poles, ethnic Poles and Polish Jews alike, suffered. In a 1940 interview with the Nazi newspaper, the National Observer, Hans Frank boasted, "In Prague, in Czechoslovakia, big red posters are put up, announcing that 7 Czechs have been shot today. If I had to put up a poster for every 7 Poles we shot, the forests of Poland would not be sufficient to produce the paper." In addition to the human cost, Poland suffered terribly in economic and material terms from the war, both from the actual fighting, from the exploitation of the Nazi occupation forces, from the bombardment. By war's end, half of Poland's railroad capacity was destroyed. 75% of all bridges in the country were blown up. 80% of all livestock in Poland were lost, killed, or else confiscated by the Germans. 25% of Poland's forests were felled. A full one-third of the country's industrial capacity was destroyed. The infrastructure of Poland, which, to be sure, had its problems even before the war, the infrastructure of Poland was simply devastated by German occupation. This chart of the Polish capital, Warsaw, shows you in red the buildings burned and destroyed in central Warsaw by war's end. The brown spaces indicate buildings left standing. And what you see here is that the historic city center was left in rubble. 8 out of every 10 buildings in the heart of Warsaw were destroyed by war's end. Here you see a famous aerial shot of Warsaw, 1945, a Polish capital reduced to rubble. Given the terrible conditions, given the brutal, murderous nature of German policy on the ground, it's no surprise, perhaps, that Poland had the largest and best organized resistance movement in all of occupied Europe. And to this day, Poles are justifiably proud of their country's resistance in time of war. They consider themselves the nation of resistance. This is one of the sort of Polish patriotic slogans. Their country was the country of resistance. And to a large extent, that's true. When we talk about Jan Gross's book, Neighbors, in a few weeks' time, the narrative of universal heroic resistance to Nazi rule turns out to be a more ambiguous story. But nonetheless, Poland is known, and Poles take great national pride in remembering their country's resistance to Nazi occupation. 1 year in, by the fall of 1940, a unified resistance movement had coalesced in occupied Poland, known in Polish as the Armia Krajowa, the Home Army, or the AK. And this is the AK armband that members of the Polish resistance wore. You see the Polish eagle and the colors of the Polish flag and the initials of the Home Army slogan, Walczała Polska, Poland is fighting. The AK, the Home Army, became a sort of umbrella organization encompassing dozens and dozens of various underground resistance groups and cells all across Poland. And the AK was in communication, too, with the Polish government in exile in London. By the summer of 1944, the AK's membership stood at 350,000 men and women. Another 25,000 young boys and girls took part in the AK's underground youth groups. So the Home Army, the AK, was the largest organized resistance movement in all of occupied Europe. The Home Army devoted much of its energy and much of its efforts to waging a guerrilla war against the German military machine. They sabotaged lines of communication, they exploded German ammunition dumps, destroyed roads and rail lines, all to disrupt the lines of supply that connected the German armies on the Eastern Front with the human and material reinforcements that they required back home. In October 1942, for example, AK demolition squads succeeded in blowing up the main loading yards at the Warsaw train station. And the explosive they used to do so had been smuggled into Poland by Polish workers who had been sent west to work in German factories. They smuggled out the explosives, the dynamite, got it into the hands of the AK, who used it to destroy the loading yards in Warsaw. On occasion, the AK even engaged in firefights and real battles with the German army. But the AK had always to proceed with great caution and secrecy. Why? Because for every act of sabotage or demolition that the AK carried out, the Nazis would conduct reprisals against the civilian population. This poster, displayed by the Nazi administration in the streets of Warsaw in 1943, announces in German and in Polish that the Nazis have executed 100 Polish civilian hostages in response to the AK's assassination of 5 German policemen and an SS officer. And the text denounces the AK not as freedom fighters, but as a, quote, terrorist organization in the service of the British, trying to drive a wedge between the Home Army and the Polish civilian population. The vast majority of the work that the AK did fell under the category of what we might call nation building, trying to keep the Polish nation together under German occupation. As one AK leader put it, the goal of the Home Army was to keep Polish society together in this time of enormous crisis, to keep Poles from becoming totally disorganized, disillusioned, in despair, to prevent Polish society from atomizing. And to do this, the AK became the most important source of information in German-occupied Poland. The AK published no fewer than 1,500 different periodicals, the most important of which was called the Informational Bulletin, as you see here. It came out in print runs of 43,000 copies per issue. The very biggest of the underground Polish printing presses could put out more than 300,000 copies of various pamphlets, brochures, and titles every month. Now, of course, the Germans had outlawed Polish language newspapers, so these had to be distributed in semi-secret fashion. Most of these underground newspapers were very small, about 5 by 10 inches, and shopkeepers who were helping to distribute these underground newspapers would wrap the papers inside customers' orders. Or Polish newsstand vendors would slip the AK papers inside the German language newspapers. And customers would give a special signal, the signal would be recognized, and a new signal given from the shopkeeper to the customer, and then the transaction could take place. Waiters would sometimes slip copies of the Polish press inside of menus, or slide it beneath a plate that was being served to a customer. And again, you had to be very, very careful, of course. All of this sort of sleight of hand was not simply for the sake of excitement. There was a real danger here. If you were caught or if you were denounced as having circulated this kind of Polish literature, the punishment was arrest and likely execution. But the importance of these underground newspapers can't be overstated. For one, I think their very existence was a clear sign to all Polish men and women that the Germans did not and could not control every aspect of their lives, no matter how hard they tried. And secondly, as the war went on, the underground newspapers became a way for Polish men and women to keep up to date on how things were going. They could receive news and information that they obviously would not get from the official German bulletins. This newspaper that you see here, for instance, entitled For a Free Poland, would publish printed excerpts from BBC broadcasts and Radio Free Europe broadcasts to keep the Polish people up to date on what was really happening, an alternate form of information. The AK engaged in symbolic gestures as well, painting patriotic graffiti to boost the spirits of the populace. And oftentimes this patriotic graffiti would take the form of this sort of anchor shape. And it's actually a P with the Polish W, again standing for Polska Walcząca, Poland is fighting. Poles who painted or sprayed up graffiti could be shot by the Nazis if they were caught, and the symbols would be swiftly painted over or scrubbed out by the Germans. But the AK made their presence felt by little gestures that meant a lot, like these defiant slogans. And this is what you see here is a commemorative street mosaic built after the war to commemorate the AK. And here, these photos are very hard to come by because, of course, the Germans would, again, paint over them or scrub them out almost immediately. But here you see a bit of AK graffiti on the base of a Warsaw street lamp. And what the AK has done here is spray paint that German slogan, "For Germans only," the same slogan that was put up on streetcars and buses And here they have, for Germans only, on the base of a lamppost. And the sort of black humor here is that only Germans should be hanged from this lamppost. So a bit of gallows humor. So what the AK did was try to keep Polish society together for the duration of the war. And the AK was able to do that in large part by building essentially an alternate society for Poles, one that existed completely outside of German occupation. The AK provided the Poles with a source of authority, a rallying point, and again, it made them realize that the Germans could not run the entire world. And it prevented Polish men and women from retreating into the shells of their own private lives, which would have been so easy to do, faced with the kinds of hardships and privations of the occupation. So the AK essentially kept Polish society from splintering apart. It kept Polish society from atomizing. And that made it possible for Polish society to be rebuilt again when the war was over. I want to close by mentioning a recent book published by Timothy Snyder, a historian at Yale, a book called Bloodlands. And it's a study of Eastern Europe in the 1930s and 40s. And in this book, Snyder argues that we really can't, or at least shouldn't, conceive of the crimes that the Nazis committed against the peoples of Eastern Europe and the crimes that the Soviets committed against the peoples of Eastern Europe. We shouldn't and really couldn't conceive of these as separate stories. They took place in the same region, the Bloodlands of Snyder's title, and they took place at roughly the same time. And often the same peoples were victimized multiple times. At various times between 1939 and 1945, the Poles were victims of the Nazis and Soviets alike. At times, the same Poles experienced what each side had to offer, and the worst of it. So when we think this week about the Polish experience, again, we have to remember that that's an experience brought upon Poles not only by the Nazis, but also by the Soviets. There are multiple perpetrators when we think about the atrocities committed in occupied Poland. And if the Germans command most of our attention, as perhaps they should, given the enormity of their crimes, again, we shouldn't leave the Soviets out of this story altogether. Witness the Katyn massacre. So for this week, again, we'll be reading David Sierrakowiak's diaries from the Łódź ghetto. And as you read them, think about how he, as a Jew living in a Polish ghetto, a Jewish ghetto on Polish territory, how he experiences the kinds of phenomena that we've talked about today, and how he and his family improvise amidst these horrific conditions, how they improvise strategies for survival. Next week, we'll see how similar strategies were devised and implemented by Soviet citizens after Operation Barbarossa began in the summer of 1941. And we'll look in particular at the 900 days, the siege of Leningrad. Thanks.